I'm here today to talk about the book that I published earlier this year called Drug Policy Constellations, with the subtitle The Role of Power and Morality in the Making of Drug Policy in the UK. And I know that not many of you are working on drug policy, so I want you to bear in mind that I'm hoping that this policy constellations approach is applicable to other areas of research, especially those perhaps that touch on public health, but maybe even broader than that as well. But why did I get into it? Partly through doing the work that I used to do in policy advice. And this question coming up. So this is one of my interviewees from the research I did for the book. Dr. Ed Day is the National Recovery Champion, and it's his job to advise the government on how to help people recover from drug use. When I interviewed him, he came up with this question, which is a question I get a lot. I'm sure you get it a lot too, Ben. Why are we doing stuff repeatedly that repeatedly fails? In this case, decriminalising drugs. Why don't we decriminalise drugs? Why are we continuing to punish people for using drugs for recreational purposes? There's no point to it. There's no evidence it works. It's expensive to do. Why are we doing it? So that's what the sort of question that the book I'm going to tell you about tries to answer. And I'll give you the answer straight away, which is the argument of the book, that to understand why drug policy and perhaps other policies take the forms they do, you can't just look at the evidence and try and translate from that into what the policy should be. You have to think about what I call the policy constellations that operate in that policy field, and I'll tell you what those are in a minute. That includes looking at what I call the ethico-political bases, the normative and political commitments that people bring to their action in policy making. You need to look at the forms of political and social power that they bring to that policy action. And you have to understand how they are used, how they use these ethico-political bases and these forms of power to work in actions collectively towards the achievement of their policy goals. So that's the overall argument, which I hope might resonate with some of the policy areas you might be working on. And I'm about to show you how it works in drug policy. Given a chance I hope to read what a policy constellation is. A fluid set of actors who come together on the basis of shared moral preferences and material interests to deploy socially structured forms of power in the pursuit of institutionalizing in policy their own moral preferences and material interests. So you can see this is a collective process, and it's not necessarily designed. It's an emergent process in critical realist terms. And in the book, I use that concept in 3 parts, which I'm going to go through as part of this talk over the next 35 to 40 minutes. First of all, looking at the conceptual framework and methods for studying how policy constellations operate in a policy field. Then the second part about thinking about the UK drug policy field. What policy constellations operate in that field? What are their ethico-political bases and what forms of power are they deploying? And then to illustrate how practically adequate that is for explaining actual policy outcomes, I'll use 2 of the 3 cases I mentioned in the book. The first is the partial and sort of almost reversed legalisation of medical cannabis in the UK that took place in November 2018. And the second in the book is the Scottish example, which works better when you present it in Scotland than in England. So I'll skip over that to thinking about the UK drug strategy, which Boris Johnson's government published in 2021, and how it came about with a rather surprising outcome, which was the investment of over £500 million in treatment for a rather denigrated group of people, which are people who use heroin mostly, which, not obvious targets of conservative largesse. Okay. So, first part of the book, thinking about where are we with drugs. I'll just cover that very briefly, and then thinking more relevantly for you and your policy areas, thinking about forms of power, forms of morality that operate in policy spaces. How do you study them? So just to sort of, the basic fact that you need to know about drug policy in the UK is it's failing massively because we've got a drug-related death crisis on our hands. This is the graph in the book. Since the book came out, the Scottish and the English and Welsh figures have come out, and that dip you're seeing there right at the end has been reversed. Both those jurisdictions have had rises of over 10% in the number of people dying with drugs in the last available figures. But people say, well, is this because drug use is going up? And no, there's something else going on, because this is the data we have from the Crime Survey for England and Wales on drug use. It is remarkably stable over the last 25 years. About 10% of the adult population reports to that survey that they've used an illicit substance in the last year, mostly cannabis. Cocaine's been increasing in the last few years. This is much more volatile for young people. But in terms of the overall adult population, you've got quite a stable pattern of drug use, but a rocketing pattern of death, clear policy failure, either to do what the policy says on the tin, which is it's supposed to reduce drug use, or to prevent this massive increase in drug-related death. So policy is failing. How do we explain the continued pattern of the same policies when that policy has obviously been failing for quite a long time? And the argument I would suggest comes from thinking about the fact that there's no such thing as evidence-based policy. I'm slightly nervous about saying this in this environment. A lot of you do evidence-based work, and I'm sort of trying to salve that by saying, well, I think a lot of you work on evidence-based interventions. There might well be such things as evidence-based interventions, but at the level of policy, there's no direct link. Forget what the ref is telling us about impact. That is not how it works. So what, if not evidence, what is it based on? The argument I'm making is that the twin bases of policy making in this policy field, I would suggest in others as well, but you'd tell me better than me, is about morality and about power. That's what policy is based on. So we need to analyze morality and we need to analyze power if we want to understand how policy processes work and the outcomes that comes out of that particularly complex and rather messy sausage machine. So let's think about that. What do we mean by these things? We can go to the work of Jürgen Habermas on power and his distinction of political from social power. So obviously political power would include the use of armed force and the police to coerce the legal system, to force people into things. One of the particularly interesting forms of political power is institutional power. The power that comes to people who hold high positions in official hierarchies, who have the legitimate interest and are given the legitimate ability to influence people by using their office to do so. And those are the sort of things we normally think about when we think about power. But in policy making, I'm also really interested in social power. Power that doesn't come from institutionals or laws or the army, but comes from social connections. We can think, Habermas talks about media power, the ability to frame what's in the media and what's in the public debate by owning the media, for example. Economic power, just being able to pay people to say certain things or do certain things. But for this analysis, I'm also particularly interested in what's known as epistemic power, the power to affect what people know, or at least think they know, about how their part of the world works. And if epistemic power is the power to affect people, what people know, then affective power is about affect, about emotion, about sentiment, about mood. Affective power is the power to affect how people feel about an issue, which in drug policy is really important. And also through doing the research, I came up with this concept of savvy social power, the power that accrues to people who are skilled at putting that network together, who can manipulate or form constellations of ideas and actors around them in ways that are quite influential. And you see in the case studies I'm going to offer two very different examples of savvy social power, which rely on people's social positions in social hierarchies and the cultural hierarchies of morality being brought together in very skilled ways. So if we think about morality now, so we've talked about forms of power, what forms of morality might be in operation. So we need to think about what the content of people's moral frameworks are. I was talking to Gabby just now about how fascinating. There's a whole variety of approaches out there. These are just some of the ones I came across that have been used to think about drug policy, about what we think are the contents of people's moral beliefs. And the two that I found most practically adequate for my use in this analysis were the moral foundations theory by Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues. Some of you may have read The Righteous Mind. Moral psychologists have varying views on it, but it's very highly cited. And then a less well-known one, which I found really useful, as you'll see, is what's called the circumplex of basic values, and developed by Sean Schwartz and colleagues. And I'll show you some of that as we go through. Now, if we use the moral foundations theory and the questionnaire that was developed by moral psychologists to measure people's attachment to particular moral values, there's, I think, 32 items on the questionnaire, or the short version. And you can break it down through various forms of cluster or factor analysis to, in the US population, 6 different moral foundations: authority, loyalty, purity, care, fairness, and liberty, they say, for the US population. A more recent test of that in the UK population, and again, we're talking social psychology, so these are mostly undergraduates. But for what it's worth, they reduced these 6 factors to 3 for their British respondents, which are traditionalism, which sort of loads on the questions such as their respect for authority, compassion, and whether you care or not if somebody is kind or generous to people or whether they're cruel, and liberty, the idea that people should be free to make decisions for themselves. And this is what Harper and Rhodes argue are the 3 moral foundations of British political thinking. For example, you can find quite strong patterns between Brexit and non-Brexit voters on these moral foundations, and you can guess which way it goes. That's based on Haidt's moral foundations theory. This is the circumplex of basic values that Schwartz proposed, again, on the basis of responses to questionnaires. They've done it, I think, at least 32 countries they've done, and they've reduced the answers people give to those sorts of questions to these 10 dimensions that they put in these 4 groups. And what I think is really interesting about the circumplex is it shows the relationships between these basic values. The idea, not just that you can distinguish values from each other, but they're in relation to each other, they're opposed to each other. Self-transcendence, so things like universal and benevolism, are opposed to self-enhancement values. I didn't realize it was touch sensitive, sorry. There you go. And similarly, these conservation values are opposed to being openness to change. So you don't tend to find them in the same people, but you might find the things that are neighboring, you might find in the same people, but not on the other side. There's this relational quality, and you can group people according to their attachment to particular, similar, or opposed moral values. And that's really important for my analysis. Sorry. Okay. So the argument I'm putting to you is that, yes, I hope we can agree that policy is not based on evidence, but it can be based on what I call these ethico-political values. You can trace the ethico-political bases of particular policy positions, and that helps explain why some people are taking the positions they are. And then if you ally the fact that some groups who have particular moral values also have different and greater forms of power or weaker forms of power, then you can use that combination to explain the outcomes of policy deliberations, which I try to do by employing this policy constellations approach. So I've already defined these policy constellations. If you think about power flowing through these networks of actors and ideas, some of you may be familiar with the advocacy coalition framework of Sabatier and Jenkins Smith. So this is a similar idea, apart from, I would say, there's a pluralist concept. And they say, I think they call it modified methodological individualism, they admit to in their writing. And this is a critical realist concept which rejects that methodological individualism and argues that these policy decisions emerge from a complex, contingent, collective process. We can't understand them by adding up the sum of individual actions, which Sabatier and Jenkins Smith claim you do. And they also claim that advocacy coalitions are, a defining feature of them is central coordination. There has to be what they call a policy entrepreneur at the centre of this who's coordinating the action. That's not what I observe in policy constellations in the drug field. I'd be interested to hear what you observe in your fields. To study the operation of policy constellations, I chose to gather data through 3 methods. One being my own experience of working as a policy advisor for various parliamentary committees, the civil service. I was seconded to the Cabinet Office for a while in 2009. And I've also worked, as Ben said, in the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs. So I sort of took notes of that along the way. I've written various things along the way about that. So I've developed that policy ethnography for this analysis as well. I also did discourse analysis of quite a lot of policy documents, think tank reports, parliamentary reports, and parliamentary debates, what people are saying in public, either in written or spoken word, about these issues. And also by interviewing 22 people from various parts of the policy field who are quite experienced in doing policy work from various different perspectives and getting their perspective from them. And coding all that in vivo and then putting it into a social network analysis. which links together the policy positions people are taking with the people who they are, the individuals and organisations in the field. And that's the basis of my identification of policy constellations, and in the thematic analysis of the documents, in the identification of the moral positions and the forms of power that they're using. So, using that data with that conceptual approach, I'll then try and show you what the ethico-political bases that inform drug policy debates are in the UK. I'll map those with a sociogram of the drug policy field, and we'll talk about what sort of forms of power different parts of the field, different constellations can deploy. So through this discourse analysis and thinking about coding that abductively on the basis of moral foundations theory and the basic values circumplex of Schwartz, thematically identified these 5 moral bases, ethico-political bases of drug policy debates. And you've got some examples here of the sorts of things people were saying and the language they're using around when they say, I support drug treatment. The sort of language they couch that in is very often about compassion. You know, we've got to be kind to people. People are dying. We want to relieve suffering. That sort of language. So it's the language that goes around the policy proposal gives you the traces of what sort of moral foundation might be in play in it. Similarly, when people talk about supporting prohibition and being punishment, the language is very traditionalist in orientation. It's favouring conformity and respect for authority. The language around liberty is very different. So when people talk about support for legalisation, they're not talking about support, conforming. They're talking about breaking with convention because we need to do things in different ways because everything's failed. We need to do something different, and we need to liberate the power of the individual and the companies that are going to provide these wonderful substances to help them enhance their lives. A very different moral basis. Paternalism is also really, I think, those of you who are doing health interventions, I'll be really interested to hear what you think about the level of paternalism one observes in the UK versus different countries, perhaps. But there's a very strong paternalist streak within UK drug policy debates. We know best what's for you. So a doctor prescribing somebody heroin and then saying you can't take heroin unless I prescribe it to you, which is what we do in this country, that's a paternalist position. But there's also another opposing thing, or perhaps overlapping thing, with progressive social justice. So support for decriminalisation, racial justice in particular, those two things since the 60s. You may be familiar with the organisation Release, and since the start of their campaigns to decriminalise cannabis, there has been a campaign for racial justice. They were working with black people who were being repeatedly criminalised. And so black lawyers and Release, this rather more middle-class white operation, came together and have done repeatedly since that time to campaign for racial justice. But this idea from Schwartz that these things are not separate, that they are in relation with each other, I try and explain with this diagram. There's an overlap between the progressive social justice and libertarian idea that people should be free to choose what's put in their body. There's an overlap between the paternalist idea that doctors know best and the traditionalist idea that people shouldn't be taking drugs unless a doctor says so. There's an overlap between progressive social justice and paternalism in reducing harm reduction being one of the things that both paternalists and progressives can believe in, as long as it doesn't interfere too much with the power of the doctor. And at the heart of this, everyone thinks they're compassionate. So people on the left quite often criticise people on the right for being cruel, heartless bastards. That is not how they see themselves. Indeed, on the right, if you interview people, they see the left as the ones who are cruel by their naivety and the way they allow suffering to run because they're so naive. And if only they were able to see how idiotic they are, they would actually care enough to do something that we are tough enough to do. So compassion is part of the self-definition, at least, of people's moral positions. I'd be interested in your views on how deep it runs. But we can think also about compassion being targeted at different groups. So if you think about, the idea of the social construction of target populations, it's also there about, who are you showing compassion to? Where are the boundaries of your compassion? So I've modified the circumplex using combining Sean Schwartz's work with the thematic analysis of the data to show that, there's some things, the dotted lines, things can go together. Everyone thinks they're compassionate, and progressive social justice and libertarians can work together. Journalists and those can work together. These can work together. There's a gap here in the policy field. Traditionalists find it very difficult to work with libertarians, even though they're both in the Tory party, which I think explains some of the Tory party's long-running problems, that there's basic moral conflict within the Tory party about status of individual freedom. Yeah, that's a side note. The main thing is to show you this social network diagram of the UK drug policy field as it was between 2015 and 2021. Now, to read the map, you need to know that the grey dots are individuals and organisations. The black dots are the policy positions that I coded from their discourses. And the size of the dots is determined by how many connections there are to them. The connections are if an organisation or individual mentioned that they were pro or anti a particular policy position. And you'll see that's what comes out if you do that in social network analysis using the Atlas 2 layout, which basically, if things are connected, they're put close together. But there's a repulsion of things that aren't connected, so they get spread out. So things over here are never mentioned by people over here, and vice versa. This gets spread out, and they talk about coil. It's like springs bringing people together if they are connected, or connected via people being similarly connected to policies. I think it gets a bit easier to see when you get closer in. So if we look at the bottom right, for example, we see a collection of Conservative politicians, including the drugs minister at the time, Kit Malthouse, Boris Johnson, alongside a collection of Conservative positions in drug policy, like support for prohibition and opposition to legalisation. You see the most extreme member here down here is Peter Hitchens. Some of you may have come across his work. I've had the pleasure of debating him 4 times. I say pleasure, very, he's the rudest man I've ever met, even in private. But yeah, he's down there at a quite an extreme part. Melanie Phillips is actually beside him. I haven't named all these things, but they're the ones that have managed to fit on the map. But this is where the traditionalists live in this map. These traditionalist people with traditionalist views that they express in their drug policy discussions. Whereas up in the top right, you see a different collection of people and ideas. The Department of Health and Social Care, OHID, or Public Health England as it used to be. Collective Voice is the organisation that represents drug treatment agencies. And the sorts of things they're in favour of are prescribing, workforce development, having a well-organised and accountable treatment force. Nothing that's too radical, but not really about punishing people, but just about getting it right for treatment services. And so I'd say this is where you could say this is informed by paternalism, because these are largely paternalist beliefs that these people at the top, I mean, John Strang's in here, he's the head of the National Addiction Centre, and he quite likes being called the Maudsley Mafia, which makes him the Don of British drug policy. But that's where he is in this field. That's the paternalist group. This over here, you see organisations like Release and their current director. You see a group around racial justice issues, a group around this sees as cannabis social clubs, which is quite a sort of social justice-y way of sharing your allowance of a few plants and then sharing out across your mates. It's not very commercial, but it is quite congruent with the idea of equity in the distribution of illicit drugs. And so this is where I would say the progressive social justice ethico-political basis expressed by these people in these policies. And the fourth corner is inhabited by cannabis companies and right-wing think tanks, people who might, for all we know, be being funded by cannabis companies. Who's funding them because they won't tell us. I asked Chris Snowden who funds him. He wouldn't tell me, like he doesn't know anyone. This is also where opposition to minimum unit pricing is, for example, for alcohol. And around that time, medical cannabis was a big issue in those years, and this was, where the money was in terms of supporting that campaign. So the liberty of individuals and companies are very important to people in this part of the sector. So if we zoom out again, we see that how this social network is shaped by attraction and repulsion to particular moral, ethico-political bases. That's what I'm arguing. To look at it a bit more schematically, we need to get rid of all the labels and think about it in terms of groups. And in social network analysis, you can identify what's known as communities or modules in the data, those groups which are most closely connected by their ties. And you can identify three groups, which I've called the conservative constellation, which overlaps with the public health constellation, where the paternalism is, and this drug policy reform constellation, where people are in support of things like decriminalisation and legalisation of drugs. But as with astronomical constellations, there are constellations within constellations. So if you go down to a more granular level, within those, for example, within the drug policy reform movement, you see a specific group of people who support progressive social justice, and they overlap with, but are distinct from, people who take a more libertarian and commercially oriented view of these matters. And there's quite often Steve Rolls, who's about here, the policy director of, when I sort of tweeted this map, he said he sent me a picture, like a GIF, of somebody straddling two racing lorries, saying that's how it feels to be in the middle here, trying to ally these two forces with each other in the pursuit of drug policy reform. So this is interesting, within the drug policy reform movement, but where the power is, I argue, is here, in the overlap between the traditionalists and the paternalists. Now, the brilliant historian Virginia Berridge wrote a book called Demons, which if you're interested in drugs and alcohol, please do read. And she said that it's the medico-penal framework, that way of thinking that has dominated British drug policy since its inception in the 1910s. This idea that it's the rightful place of doctors, police officers, and the Home Office to be in charge of drug policy. That's what I call the medico-political constellation. That's where the Tory ministers are. That's where the senior police officers are. And it's them who get to decide with certain effects. Before I move on to the particular case, I just want to make note of two particular absences here. One is the absence, almost the virtual invisibility of people who actually use drugs in these policy discussions. It's not that there's nobody who uses drugs in them. It's just nobody's owning up to it and using that as their basis for expertise. So lived experience is pretty invisible in UK drug policy discussions, as are young people. Now, the majority of people who use illicit drugs are under 25. The median age of my interviewees was well over 50, as is my own. So policy making is an old person's game, whereas the people who experience the effects of it tend to be under 25. So just to note that before we go on to thinking about how this framework, the conceptual framework and the empirical methods help us understand particular cases in policy. How am I doing for time? Yeah. Fantastic. So the first case I'm going to talk about is the partial legalisation of cannabis for medical purposes in the UK, which happened in November 2018. I was a very peripheral player in this because I was on the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs at the time, and the decision was referred to us. But the main players were these people. And when I presented this before, people have taken from the fact that I'm showing pictures of individuals to be an over-individualistic analysis, which is a fair trait when you're showing pictures of individuals. But I want you to remember that these individuals don't arise sui generis. They come from constellations of ideas, organizations, power, money that produces the ability for them to take part in these policy debates. But they have their own part to play. Paul Flynn, the late Paul Flynn, spent decades campaigning for cannabis legalization. And here he is with the banner when he did a private members bill about legalizing medical cannabis. And that banner is of the United Patients Alliance, which is an organization of people who campaign for their own liberty to use cannabis as a medicine for their own ailments. But that was not a very effective campaign, according to this guy, Steve Moore, who you may remember the Big Society as David Cameron's big idea. That was Steve Moore's idea, or at least he claimed so. He was an advisor to David Cameron at the time. After leaving Downing Street, he formed an organisation called Voltfas, which basically the only purpose of Voltfas was to legalise cannabis. It was funded by, do you remember, nobody's old enough, maybe some people are old enough here to remember Bebo, a prototypical social network that was sold in 2008. This will show you how long it goes. It was sold for 800, the paltry sum of 800 million quid. And Paul, what's their name, was one of the brothers, and he gave some of those millions to Steve Moore to campaign for cannabis legalisation, showing one aspect of economic power. Now, Steve Moore came across Charlotte and Billy Caldwell. Steve Moore told me when I interviewed him about his plan. He had a plan in place for how to get cannabis legalised, but he needed the effective power of a suffering family in order to do it. This was the suffering family that he came across. Billy Caldwell was at that time suffering, repeated epileptic fits, which were only treatable by cannabis as a medicine, which he was getting, but then that was stopped by the Home Office, and that was used by Steve Moore in this argument against Sajid Javid, who was the Home Secretary at the time, and Nick Hurd, who had the misfortune to be in the game of revolving chairs that is the drugs minister's post at that time. He later revealed that he didn't even believe in prohibition while he was doing that job. But it fell to him to actually defend the government's position, which became untenable in the following way. So up till about 2018, people like Paul Flynn, United Patients Alliance, have been doing this traditional forms of campaigning, turning up at Parliament, lobbying, petitions. Nothing was moving very much. But there were some interesting shifts in the epistemic knowledge. People like David Nutt and his friend Mike Barnes were doing stuff around the benefits of cannabis for medical use. That was in the medical literature. And there was stuff around how dangerous or undangerous it was that was available for use in these debates. In the summer of 2018, Steve Moore embarked on what I've called a campaign of political cornering. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, leading to a media, what some friends and colleagues of mine has described as a manufactured scandal. Some of you may remember that in the summer of 2018, for 1 week, there was hardly anything else in the tabloid or any other press apart from Billy Caldwell and his terrible problems not being able to get cannabis. And that led to Sajid Javid basically buckling and announcing a review, which when he announced it, as you'll see, it was pretty obvious he was going to try and legalise cannabis, or at least enable Billy Caldwell to get his cannabis, to try and dampen down the media outcry. But that was then taken over by the institutional mechanisms of what I would call a reversal of the direction in which it was going. So since 2018, more than 80,000 people have been able to get private prescriptions. If you find a friendly doctor and you're willing to pay more than £300 a month, you can have cannabis in this country. But if you want to get it on the NHS, there's less than 5 people who've been prescribed for medical use. A 2-tier system that's been created by this emergent properties and processes of what was going on in the summer of 2018. And it was described to me by Paul North, who's succeeded Steve Moore as the head of this think tank, Voltfas. And he says, what you need to do is you need to put politicians in a situation where they had to engage. They couldn't just ignore it anymore. It was all over the papers. It's clearly upsetting. You're triggering that affective power. And you're giving them a way out. That's political cornering. You put people in a corner. The only way out is the way that you want them to go. In this case, the only way out was to allow Billy Caldwell to have his medicine because it was so upsetting. You're now in a position where they have nowhere else to go. That's why I call it political cornering. And the way that Steve Moore did this was that he knew that Charlotte Caldwell could get medical cannabis in Canada. He sent her off to Canada with a journalist. They came back to Heathrow, and as Steve Moore predicted would happen, that cannabis was confiscated. They had a press conference at Heathrow. 2 days later, Charlotte was on breakfast television accusing Nick Hurd of basically killing her son. Now, what could be more effective as an appeal than to say, you're killing my child? And it was effective as well, in that there was a media storm, and the only way out of the media storm was Sajid Javid making a statement in the House of Commons where he said, it's time to review this. We're going to allow Billy Caldwell to have his medicine. But you'll see he'd already built in the caveat. We're not going to weaken the general approach. We still have to be tough. As traditionalists, conservatives, we have to be tough on drugs. So the institutional backlash kicked in fairly soon. This is the bit where I was involved in, the decision about what class and schedule, what schedule of misuse of drugs regulations of cannabis came to the ACMD. I was on a minority of one saying it should be in the same schedule as anabolic steroids. And everybody else said it should be in Schedule 2 alongside heroin. I see no reason why a substance that's non-lethal and overdosed, like cannabis, should be in the same schedule as heroin, but that's where it was placed. Similarly, NICE was asked to do a review, and lots of people whose families suffer from epilepsy and other things that can be treated with cannabis were very hopeful that they would put epilepsy on the list and people could get prescriptions. That didn't happen. Only a very small number of conditions were approved, hence why there's still so few people getting prescribed cannabis on the NHS. So this institutional backlash, this rearguard action, was effective in limiting access and creating this two-tier system. So if you think about that in terms of policy constellations, you see this action between this drug policy reform movement, so Steve Moore and his acolytes down here, with some support from social progressives like Paul Flynn and Release and Transform, who'd been campaigning for a long time, managing to put people in the medico-political constellation in a corner from which the only way out was to at least do something to allow Billy Caldwell to have his medicine. But again, to use the institutional levers of power to keep that really close, tightly packed and controlled. 5 minutes for the last case I'm going to give you, which is this curious example of how you get £500 million out of a Conservative government to spend on people they consider as beneath contempt, i.e. stigmatised labels of junkies get used for that population. How do you do that? How do you get people who haven't done that and have been taking money away from people who are in that category deliberately for more than a decade? Well, you do it by what I would call very savvy political power by a woman called Dame Carol Black. So the two big players in this story of the 2021 drug strategy are Boris Johnson, who had the final say of what would be in it, and Dame Carol Black, who was strangely, sort of Sajid Javid was involved here because he commissioned her to write a report about drug policy in 2019 when he was health secretary. He then received that report 2 years later when he was home secretary. And I think Sajid Javid, I'd love to interview him about it, but he's been quite cagey about it. Anyway, she was quite attuned to how you get people together in the medico-penal constellation, a real insider. She's a very distinguished clinician herself. She's also been head of Newnham College in Cambridge. She's very well connected. She's written several government reports on various things, and she knows how to get things done, which in her case is, rather than creating a manufactured scandal, to do things very quietly. She told me, for example, that she would never, if she was ever to criticise a minister, she certainly wouldn't do it in public. She would even get the civil servants to leave the room before she did it, because the worst thing you can do if you want ministers to do anything is embarrass them. A lesson perhaps for us all in our shouting and doing it the wrong way, which I've been doing for years, apparently. But she also, it's not just her, it's a policy zoo. People use that phrase, a zoo of people who are involved in writing policy. A zoo is a really interesting metaphor because it sort of suggests chaos while all at the same time having bars and sections and order. And I really like that as a metaphor for the policy process. So what happened was that she, in her review, sort of relied on particular ethico-political concepts around the idea that drug use is wrong, a traditionalist idea, the idea that drug use is harmful, which is a paternalist view. It doesn't matter whether it's wrong or not, it's just harmful. We know that it harms health, so we want to reduce it. And that punishment deters, again, quite a traditionalist idea. So we invest in drug treatment and we threaten people with tough consequences. You remember there was a media splurge at the time around how people were going to have their passports taken away and they were going to be stopped from driving, that sort of thing. Never happened, but that was the media announcement that went around it. Deliberately excluded from this, and quite explicitly, when I interviewed Carol Black, she told me that she didn't want to get into all the debates around decriminalisation and legalisation. That was a distraction to what she wanted to do, which was to get money into the treatment system, which had been taken out under the years of austerity. So she deliberately ignored progressive and libertarian ideas around drug policy. So there was no consideration in the drug strategy whatsoever of decriminalisation or legalisation. It just wasn't on the table. And instead, what was driving the narrative of the drug strategy was a narrative that had been used previously, 20 years ago, by a guy called Mike Trace, a former employer of mine, and the drug czar at the time, Keith Hellawell, that the idea that you can justify investment in drug treatment, not by the health effects of drug treatment in saving lives, but by the fact that it reduces crime. And that is a perfect melange of a traditionalist argument that you need to reduce drug use because it's wrong, and a paternalist argument that you can save money by being more effective, with the idea that we're being compassionate as well. Fantastic. So one of the big sort of factoids that Carol Black relied on in this debate was the idea that if you spend £1 on drug treatment, you get £5 back. I spend weeks, months of my life showing how that's nonsense. But it's a very effective political argument. And that was the argument that was used in the early 2000s to get money out of the new Labour government. It was the same argument that was used to get money out of Boris Johnson, and he went for it. It went down to the wire, I'm told, by the people who were involved about whether this money would be put in or not. And it was finally Boris Johnson's call. And he went for the argument that we can save money here by investing in drug treatment, which is what the drug strategy did. And this was orchestrated in a very savvy way by Carol Black, but only because she understood the social collective processes so well. It's not that she's a brilliant woman, and there's a long line of brilliant women in drug policy, Ruth Runciman, going back to Baroness Wotton, but all of them were brilliant in the way that not only had they great minds as individual thinkers, but they were brilliant at bringing people together in collective action. So if we think about it in terms of constellations, what's going on? Well, all the action here is within the medical penal constellation. People like Steve Moore, people like Released, weren't even invited into the meetings. People who had the wrong kind of drug problem experience, so i.e. people who believed in harm reduction, weren't really in that room. There were some people there who'd recovered through abstinence-based programs, but mostly it was civil servants and their selected experts who got to be in the room through the orchestration of Carol Black. And that was what informed the narrative that was effective. So in the final chapter of the book, I produced 10 propositions which I hope will explain drug policy making, and maybe we'll explain drug policy making in your fields as well. I won't go through them now because, well, we're getting close to the end. And I also contextualize this by comparing it, for example, with the Advocacy Coalition framework and the advantages and disadvantages of using either particular way of looking at these things. But the argument I make is that the policy constellation approach offers a practically adequate way of explaining about acting in drug policy. I suggest, for example, that people should think about rewiring their networks, thinking about who are the powerful players and what are the powerful positions and what are the salient features of your network, and how do you get connected to those in ways that can allow savvy political action to actually make change. So instead of, this is the summary of my argument. So it may be that policy is not based on evidence, but we can increase the chances of there being evidence-informed policy that is more effective and less unjust if we understand that these are actions of moral creatures who have ethico-political preferences and various forms of power that they use in institutionalizing those. And that's what explains the eventual outcome of drug policy decisions. But I'm also hoping that you might be thinking about areas where you work in, that this might be useful as well. So I'll finish, instead of finishing with a final conclusion, I'm going to finish with some questions for you to consider about your own policy areas. What policy constellations are operating around the interventions or programs that you're working on? What ethico-political bases inform those constellations? Or is it purely technical? What forms of power are they using? Are people buying lobbyists? Are they doing advertising? Or is it more subtle than that? Are they using savvy power? These sort of connections that happen behind the scenes to get things done. And do you have any counterexamples? I mean, I'd be fascinated. I've made this claim that there's no such thing as evidence-based policy. If you have a case of a policy that was made purely on the basis of the evidence, I've got one small one that I might talk about later. But you might be able to tell me others more grand examples of where this whole explanation falls down, because there is purely evidence-based policy out there. But yeah, I look forward to your questions and your discussion. Thank you very much.